Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining to our SAP Community Call today. My name is Lena. I'm part of the Community and Influencers team, and I'm moderating this SAP Community Call today for and with the SAP S4HANA team. And today is all about SAP S4HANA manufacturing, what it is, what is new about it, and how you can benefit from it. We have two speakers from our SAP S4HANA Solution Management team today with us as our experts. Happy to introduce them to you. Stefan Gerber, Vice President in the SAP S4HANA Solution Management team, and Jakob Schneller, Solution Specialist in the SAP S4HANA Cloud Solution Management team.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So both of them dedicated their time to you today for you to address your questions. As always, an SAP Community Call is a 60-minute session. Now, meanwhile, streaming live here on YouTube. Stefan and Jakob will present for 40-45 minutes, and we'll have enough time towards the end to address your questions. Therefore, you should be logged into YouTube to participate in the chat. And you can already do so and let us know from where you're joining us today. And I will be moderating the Q&A then later on. And with that being said, I'll hand over to Stefan to start presenting.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for introducing. My name is Stefan Gerber. I'm presenting out of my home office close to Waldorf. So it's pretty warm there. So if I get sweating, that's mainly not because of your question, but rather because of the sun coming in here. We would like to give you an overview about S4HANA manufacturing, what's the scope, what is still there compared to ECC, and also what's new and how to benefit. Thanks a lot also to Jakob for helping to prepare everything and also doing a major part of the presentation. The first part, intro into SAP S4HANA manufacturing. We actually had in R2 already manufacturing functionality. At that time, it was still called PPS, Production Planning and Steuerung in German. So it was already integrated into the logistics modules from procurement, from inventory management, from sales, and so on. But then we actually increased the scope with R3, not the first two modules didn't, or first releases where VP was not very well established there, but then we brought this functionality in, and also we introduced some industry solutions that were already there earlier. With R3 Enterprise, our 4.7 release, we enhanced that part for the industry scope, also bundled a couple of industries like the discrete industry and milk products into one delivery scope. The next major change was SAP ERP. So that's the license name for the ECC Enterprise Core component. And here we introduced the enhancement pack strategy. So we delivered additional enhancement based on enhancement packs. You could switch it on via the switch framework and then add additional functionality. Here it was already the first part where you can actually also access functionality, which was on a industrial solution outside of your own industry. A big change was SAP S4HANA. Why? Of course, we had the chance here to cut some of the historical grown long tail, come up with simplification, which you can also see in the simplification list, what the changes are. Also, everything is based on the S4HANA database and also optimized for S4HANA, and therefore it makes it much more performant than previous parts of it. Now, in our current release, 2021, so it came out in October last year, we also gave a new version of what we called Radiator, our solution map. What does it do? We look at our scope in line of businesses in columns and also from a license point of view in rows. What does it mean from the logistics side? So we have in the middle a dark gray area, which everything covers what is included in the enterprise management license. Also, if we look at the scope for the logistics line of businesses in a very high level, you could say this is similar to what was available in ECC as well. And also we combine this with the finance, HR, and also some cross-industry functionality. If we have industry-specific functions or intelligent solutions, and of course, sustainable features as well. On top of that, in the dark gray area, this is still under the S/4HANA umbrella, but comes with an additional price tag. So these are solutions that are typically either newly developed on S/4HANA or taken over from previous business suite products, like from SCM or CRM. Now we would like to have a closer look into our manufacturing column. The upper part with the digital manufacturing cloud, there were already SAP community sessions, also for the constraint-based planning, PPDS or PEO, production engineering and operations. We had separate sessions. Therefore, in this one, we would like to focus on the PP part, production planning and control. It's not, of course, only production planning. There are also some production order functionalities which are rather go into the control or operations area. With that, we already run into the next section. What's the big picture of our S/4HANA manufacturing solutions? We divide it into business areas. The first one is manufacturing engineering, covering mainly the master data objects from material master / product master, bill of materials for the structures, routings, and recipes for processes, and work centers and production lines as the infrastructure. With the planning part, there is a small forecast functionality in S/4HANA where you can standard flat forecasting or trend or seasonal forecasting. However, if you want to have sophisticated forecasting functionality, we recommend to use SAP IBP Integrated Business Planning for that. Material requirements planning is probably the heart of our SAP S/4HANA planning solutions. We will have later a closer look in what the details are around this. Also, capacity planning and production scheduling or shop floor planning are features under the planning business area. Operations, we have this life cycle of a production order. We also look later a little bit closer into it. Then there are several options or specific models how to cover manufacturing processes, ones for this discrete industry, but also for process industries with process orders, production planning, PI, and repetitive manufacturing. It's kind of a way of discrete manufacturing, but not creating a production order for, let's say, its lot size, but combining these in periodical orders like monthly order, and then settle and reconciliate at the end of the month. Project manufacturing part, if you combine this with our PS system, that we have the work breakdown structures and also production orders based on the project, and also inventory kept separate from all available inventory to only the project specific inventory. Replenishment options, how to replenish the production supply, could be one for the outsourced manufacturing, but mainly also for just-in-time and Kanban replenishment for the production line. different strategies about from make to stock, make to order, design to order, engineer to order, assemble to order. All these are controlled via strategy part of it. And our quality management system is also embedded in the manufacturing processes, part on the quality planning, but also in inspection during production and at the end of the production, but also inspection of components when they come in from supplier. And the important part as well, the quality improvement. On top of this, we have these areas that we saw earlier, these light gray areas with an additional price tag for the predictive and demand driven. You will see later on that this is now actually part of the core. So that means no additional price tag for predictive MRP and as well for demand driven MRP. Jakob will later talk about in more detail on these additional MRP scenarios. PEO, production engineering and operations, are advanced functionalities from the engineering part, also from the transition of the engineering BOM into the production BOM, but also from the operation parts, mainly for one part could be the confirmation of the production orders, where we have a much more sophisticated buy-in process as compared to the standard PP part. With that, I would just pick in some of these boxes to highlight what's the function behind here. So product definition, we define the product based with our material master and also the manufacturing relevant views on this. In the first one, we, of course, look at the material types and then also check which are relevant for production. Of course, the finished product, what's the end of our production, but it could also be semi-finished products or components, raw materials for the operations. Different MRP types from consumption-based planning or order-based planning, also way for forecast planning, whether you get the forecast either from the S/4HANA system or from an external planning system. Log sizes procedures, these are the ones that are delivered by standard, and you also have the option of configure your own lot size procedures in the system. As you see, I have some problems with my presenter here. So if we look at the next part, the product structure, the bill of materials, how we handle these or how we map them in the system. Typically, we have one header item, which is then the finished product and several components that go into that. That could be in a one-level part if we only look at the blue components, but it could also be multi-level or a combination of different bill of materials to have a big structure behind that. Also, there are other possibilities like co-products from the process orders, where you not only produce one product, but you get also a different product, and also you split the cost accordingly. On the discrete side, we also have the focus or the option of the byproducts. This is if you put a negative quantity in the line item, that means that it actually occurs during the production process. You see there's a lot of information on the slides. You also have the option later on to download the script to it. Also, there will be much more information on the specific boxes. We just don't have the time here to go through all of them. Therefore, I would just like to go a little bit more on the MRP part. So what is MRP actually doing? First, we have some prerequisites, how we run MRP. So which products or which materials do we select? Do we select all? Do we only go for a group or for single materials? Do we also want to look only at the ones that have changed during between the last run, so whether we have goods receipts or goods issues, and therefore it changes the stock requirement situation. The second step is the net requirement calculation. What does this do? It calculates, or it looks at what's on hand, what the planned goods issues, what are the planned demands, or what are the planned incoming parts, like the goods receipt and other parts of it. And then at the end, it calculates the net requirements and uses the lot size procedure to actually calculate the real replenishment amount. Then we explode the bill of material, look at all the dependent requirements from the components below. Also here we do the net calculation, and then we assign a source of supply, or the system assigns a source of supply if it's properly maintained. There are several options like the internal or external procurement, as well as the special procurement keys. So then you can, for example, procure the parts from a different plant or from a subcontractor, or from a consignment inventory store. Scheduling is the last part of the MRP. There we calculate the lead time, not only the lead time, for example, between the supplier and us, but also some processing times on our side. And altogether, this is then reflected in the required date of the replenishment proposal. Now we get into the operation part. What's the life cycle of a production order? First, it's typically transferred from a planned order. It's created. It also gets the reservation or creates the reservation for the components and reserves capacity for the required work centers. Also, it prints the documents or issues the ones for the mobile devices. Then actually the production gets triggered, the start of it, the control of it, the inspection of it, and the confirmation of the first operation. After we confirm the last operation, we are actually ready to post the goods receipt from the finished product into our warehouse, and also settle the production order from a financial or cost point of view. And then this completes the whole cycle of the production order. I want to finish my part with a quick look at integration. So typically, if you talk about SAP, there are a couple of sentences you pretty get soon to the term integration, or sometimes the lack of integration. How are we integrated in as for manufacturing with different SAP modules and SAP objects? For example, in the engineering part, of course, you have seen already before the material master, where we use the same object as with other departments, and you also see a big list of additional objects that are leveraged throughout the life cycle in manufacturing. The real good thing is all of these objects reside natively in SAP S/4HANA. So there's no need to kind of integrate to different systems for these objects, also not to replicate, to build clones or something. So we are always referring to the original objects, also referring in real time to it. And then that makes it much more efficient, and also there is no redundancies or inconsistencies because of the interface. Also, as mentioned, we share the same master data with other logistics modules, like the material master, but as well the business partner, or for example, for the vendor master, where we have a view for the procurement side, as well as a view from the financial side. Also for transaction data, we use the same structure like for the material documents, whether it's a goods issue or a goods receipt. stock transfer, inventory adjustments. We use the same structure, just with different movement times and therefore different account assignments. And very important, we are always connected with a financial system. So each material, or not each, but most or all the financial relevant material documents come up with a twin, like the financial document versus the material document. And therefore, logistics and financials are always in sync. Last not least, the integration with the other logistics line of businesses like R&D, sourcing and procurement, inventory, supply chain management. You see them, so we are directly integrated into these functionality. With this, I'd like to hand over to Jakob for the new stuff in manufacturing.
So great. I should be audible now and also visible, correct? And you should see chapter number 3 now, correct?
Correct.
Stefan, can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. Then, yeah, thank you very much, Stefan, for giving this background on manufacturing in S/4HANA or in SAP, in the SAP context from a historical point of view, and also describing what is in from what people already probably know from the old ECC world. And yeah, a very warm welcome also from my side. I'm now focusing on the topics of news and highlights, and will hopefully also have the chance to demo a little bit. The idea of this news and highlight sections is really to look into things that have looked differently in the ECC world, and that has typically two main drivers. One of those main drivers is the topic of performance. So we really try to leverage the gained performance from the HANA database as good as possible and re-engineering all the apps and processes. And on the other hand side, we of course have a complete new user experience paradigm, which is also very much visible in those news and highlights. And combined, that really leads to new apps, new user experience, new processes. And there I have picked a few examples which are clustered around the topic of MRP and production planning. So how does this look like? And I hope my slides move. Yeah, there we go. So first of all, as said, if we look really at the core piece of logistics in SAP ERP systems, the MRP run, there we can already, if we only look really basically only on this object, we can already see improvements that are then of course later on leveraged in all those apps. And that is really the performance, and the result of that is really that we have a 10 times faster MRP run, which at the same time requires 5 times less storage. And that in the end enables us to really do an MRP run at the click of a button, compared to the past where we really needed to do MRP runs as batch jobs overnight. And that is already quite a significant improvement. And still, of course, the MRP run does what it needs to do, really being the core piece in logistics, connecting our demand with the actual supply and how the supply can be provided to this demand. If we then look at some examples for the highlights and at some apps that have resulted from this performance increase and from the new user experience, the SAP Fiori, then the first application I would like to focus on is the real-time MRP cockpit. And it already mentions it in its name, kind of. So it really leverages those real-time capabilities coming from the increased performance to allow things that haven't been possible before. Like, for example, simulating resolution proposals. If you have a bottleneck in matching demand with supply, then this application allows you to simulate potential resolution options for that. And that is perfectly supported by the user interface that really embedded graphics simulates the current stock situation and how that can be improved by taking the action that is simulated and suggested by the system. So that is one of the most core functionalities or core new apps that we have here, but that's of course not all. The second one I would like to focus on, which is closely related to this MRP cockpit, is what we call the collaborative MRP. And that goes a little bit in the direction of the integration topic that Stefan was also mentioning already. So first of all, it kind of builds a bridge between the MRP planning and the procurement department, but then goes even further and also facilitates the integration into potential business networks, like supplier networks, like our SAP Ariba network. So what can we do in this case? So imagine we're having our MRP cockpit and we're simulating, for example, that a purchase order needs to be shifted in order to mitigate the bottleneck. Then we can use the collaborative MRP to basically manage the life cycle of this change request and the communication with the respective supplier. And do that really in a streamlined and structured way, and leverage the integration in the network to finally get a confirmation. The next thing that is definitely worth mentioning, because that hasn't existed in that way in the old ERP ECC world at all, is what we call the predictive MRP. And what basically happens here is that we have the chance to use this application in order to optimize our demand plans with regards to the constraints we, for example, have in terms of work centers in a mid to long term view, in order to come up really with a feasible demand plan that we can then later on feed into our MRP, and that has already, at least on a higher level, considered that there might be work centers, for example, that have some capacity restriction. I will have also a little demo on that topic later on. And the final news and highlights topic that I would like to mention is the demand-driven MRP. And you probably also remember those two terms, so predictive MRP and demand-driven MRP. Those are also exactly those two functionalities that are now have quite recently been made available as part of the core license. So you really now get them without paying an extra fee, which is of course also another incentive to really look at those functionalities. So demand-driven MRP, that is an option that allows you to really try a different paradigm to do your production planning, which really rather goes in this direction of decoupling points in your within your value chain to mitigate things like a bullwhip effect. I will also have a dedicated slide on that a little later. So with that, I think that's a nice summary of all the innovations and news that have happened around the topic of MRP alone. And I think it gives kind of a feeling for what improvements S/4HANA can offer to you. And you have always to keep in mind, it's really mostly based on the fact that we have this higher performance, that we have this new UI paradigm, and that really gives us a complete environment to rethink our processes and to develop applications that really fit the needs of the users. So with that, let's get into some further details of those three examples I have mentioned here. For the first one, I just want to do a little bit of advertising here. So basically, I don't have a dedicated slide on the MRP cockpit, but what we have done actually a video that is comparing how the old SAP or the old ECC ERP user interface behaves compared to the new S/4HANA Fiori user interface. We're really tracking the time you need to fulfill a process on the left-hand side compared to the time you need to fulfill the process on the right-hand side, how many clicks you need, and how many fields need to be filled, so how cumbersome or not cumbersome or streamlined the process is. And if you're interested in really having this comparison and understanding also the benefits of the new apps and the new UIs, I can highly recommend to later on, if you download a handout, click on that video or directly search the video title here on the web to have a look at that. Next one, I already explained quite comprehensively. So the collaborative MRP, we will also have a short demo on that in a second. But to repeat it once again, the idea is really to first of all have on the S/4HANA side really a structured management of MRP change requests that are kind of exchanged between the manufacturing department and the purchasing department, and at the same time have really an instant connection and an instant exchange with the supplier via our supplier network. Details about how this connection looks like and what is replicated or communicated between the systems can be found on this slide. Predictive MRP, as we also have a demo on that, I also keep it very short here. The idea is really we start with a top-level demand, which we have potentially imported from an S&OP system like our SAP integrated business planning. And now we really want to optimize this initial demand plan with regards to the capacity constraints. So what we do is we do a kind of a simulative MRP run, which checks against the work centers and gives us first results. So you, for example, have so many capacity issues. And then we use the simulative capabilities of S4HANA to resolve this. And in the end, if we have a feasible demand plan, we can apply it. More for that in a second in the demo. And the last thing I wanted to give you a detailed view on is once again the topic of demand-driven MRP. So as said, the idea is really to do replenishment planning and MRP or materials planning from a kind of different perspective with a different logic. And they really offer you, as part of the core license, meanwhile, a holistic set of tools that starts with really tools to better understand your inventory behavior, then tools where you can enter and monitor where you would like to put strategic buffers into your value chain, and also then defining different thresholds for those buffers in order to exactly determine when at this buffer a replenishment order should be created. And by this you can, you have a different form of replenishment planning, a different form of replenishment execution, and of course you can also monitor each of that with a dedicated app for that. So really a comprehensive tool set to go for this demand-driven approach of MRP, so materials requirements planning. And with that, I would like to come to the okay, that's also, I've nearly forgot about this slide. So what we have in addition, so we remember we have the increased performance and we have the new user interface. What we have on top even is also that we looked at the processes and thought, how can we kind of even further enhance them by applying intelligent technologies. And here's just one example of this really end-to-end manufacturing process, from the master data really down to the confirmation and the quality management in the end. And whenever there's here a little symbol like this one or this little bot, this indicates that we built in here some intelligent technologies, like, for example, machine learning in order to predict the lead time for a buffer. In this case, it's demand-driven MRP, the lead time for a buffer based on the historic experience, based on the historic data. Other example that rather goes in the direction of automation is, for example, a bot that allows to automate the upload of plant-independent requirements. And you see we have a lot of further bots down here for production confirmation, or also in the area of quality management. And finally, there's also another concept that is pretty unique to S4HANA, and that is the so-called situation handling. And situation handling is basically supporting the exception handling process in a system. So what you get if you apply situation handling is you not only get a message that points you to a exception where the need for action exists, but it also, if you click on that, you get really the context of this whole exception, and in many cases even a resolution proposal, how to resolve this exception as efficient as possible. And that can, for example, here be applied in the context of the MRP cockpit. So imagine there's a purchase order has been changed manually, then you as a material planner get here a notification in form of a situation handling notification, where you then exactly see what has happened and what does this mean for my material requirements planning. Finally, what we also in some areas support is the integration into an Internet of Things environment, so a sensor environment to further automate processes. Like, for example, in our case here, the Kanban replenishment. So we have the option to really directly integrate our Kanban application into the IoT environment, which offers sensors to, for example, then give a message or trigger a message that a Kanban container has been emptied, and that automatically triggers the subsequent processes in the S4 system. So creating a new purchase order, setting the status of the container to empty. And yeah, with that, we really try to, on top of the processes that we and apps that we have improved based on user experience and the performance. We even also try to weave in those kind of intelligent technologies wherever we consider it helpful and possible. And also there, and that ends really this presentation part and leads us to the demo. Also there we have a nice video that is available publicly, that is also linked here, which shows some of those examples and gives a little bit more context to it than I have just done. And with that, let us jump to our demo chapter and start with the first demo, which is the demo about predictive MRP. And to give you a little bit of background here on this predictive MRP demo, I already mentioned it. The idea is to optimize the demand forecast with regards to potential constraints of your work centers, to capacity constraints of your work centers. So you have basically now fed in some high-level material demand for the next 8 weeks in this case, I think. And now the system has calculated in a simulative run if there will be capacity issues with this initial plan. And now you have the option to resolve that. And this is exactly the point where we jump into the application, which is called Process PMRP Simulations. And I just filter here to my demo view. And you see, I have already prepared here one of such simulations, and it tells us if we would like to have a delivery performance of 100% in this context, we would need to we would run into 2 capacity issues. And now we can, of course, go into details here and identify what capacity issues that would be. And then the system really quite intuitively already shows us here on the very top what issues we have. In this case, it says, okay, we have 1 violated constraint. So you can indicate if a supplier, for example, can deliver a maximum of 1,000 or 10,000 components. And whenever that is exceeded, then you would get raised an exception here. And you also see here the capacity issues with your work centers. And now you can really intuitively dive into each and every of those exceptions in order to resolve them. So for example, we can now open here this violated constraint and see here that 500 pieces are kind of affected here in one of the weeks, in one of the planned weeks. We can then drill into it and get further details. So, and we can also open here further details to really get the full transparency. And then we look where it is flagged as red. And then we see here in week 30, the supplier is actually, or we have defined a constraint for the supplier of 10,000 pieces of this subcomponent 01. And actually we would need 10,500. So we have here a difference of 500. And now we can think, okay, how can we resolve this? And the first step of resolving that, I want to show you how that could be done really manually. So this is why we jump back to the demand plan simulation. And the idea, the really basic idea is to say, okay, let's try to lift and shift a little bit in order to resolve this violated constraint. And what we see already here, and we know it was related to the material R10. So we see that in week 30, we actually don't produce anything of this material. So the direct idea would be, okay, why not shifting a little bit of the demand from this week to, so from the critical week to this week 30, where we don't produce anything. So let's do that. Let's say we shift 3,500 to week 30. That means reducing in week 31 to 3,700. And if we enter that, you will already see that the system responds accordingly. Here you now see that would already, resolve our violated constraints, but it would also impact, of course, our delivery performance because we would, at the moment, deliver 500 pieces too less. This is why we now add those 500 pieces in this week and see what the system then tells us. And it now tells us, okay, if you do it this way, you would have no violated constraints and still 100% delivery performance. Great. So we have resolved this first issue. That means we now have 2 issues left, and those we are now not tackling that manually, but really also using the guidance of the system for that. So if we click here, we see we have problems at the work center, the assembly work center in 2 weeks. What we can now do, we can first of all investigate a little bit more detailed into those weeks. So let's start with the week 31, and we see here that 1,000 pieces are critical and leading to this 6% overload. We can now also drill down a little bit more and get really a structured view of all the components that could potentially lead to that. And that takes a little bit, but then we see it here. And if we now click here on those critical 1,000 pieces, then the system tells us that we would potentially have 2 options to kind of resolve that. One is grayed out. That means we haven't made an alternative source of supply that could mitigate this capacity issue. But what we could do now in a system guided way is really pull in quantity. So thinking about, is there another week where we can already produce some of the required demand in order to don't have this or to not have those capacity issues in week 30. And we see here the system recommends us to redistribute 300 pieces to week 29. And if we are fine with this proposal, we can just very simple click here on adopt and apply this and see what happens based on the proposal of the system. And we see it keeps our delivery performance up with 100%, but reduces our capacity issues to 1. With that, let's do one final thing and see one other option how we can resolve the capacity issues. By that, for that, we go here directly into this issue. And now you see we are no longer in the demand plan simulation, but in a capacity plan simulation. So now we really don't look at it from a demand plan and shift in the demand plan, but we look if we can change the capacity to a certain extent. And we see here the problem is really here in week 29 now that we have 2.4 hours to less capacity. And we can also visualize that graphically to get further details. So we can also click here and really see this embedded analytics and those interactive graphics in the user interface. And we see the feasible load here would be 40. We have an overload of 2.4 hours. And once again, the system says, okay, there are 2 options. You could either disregard the capacity issues, or you can also change the available capacity. So maybe you think about, okay, it's possible as we only are 2.4 hours over our utilization, we might be able to cover this by adding an additional shift or by lifting and shifting resources to a certain extent, and by discovering what is missing in terms of capacity. And in case of the demo, we do exactly that. We look what the system proposes us. It proposes us to go to a capacity utilization of 106%. We are okay with that, adopt that, and apply it. And if we do so, we see we now have come up finally with our feasible demand plan. So 0 capacity issues, 100% delivery performance, 0 materials with invalid source, and 0 violated constraints. Finally, as typically we will not in real life have just 2 capacity issues, it would also make sense to understand what have we done as part of the simulation in order to also lift and shift between the different steps and really have the full transparency what has happened to come up with this feasible demand plan. And therefore the solution offers here a so-called simulation summary that once again exactly tells you what has happened in order to come up with this feasible demand plan. So we did changes in demand, changes in capacity, and we did some pre-production, and that in the end led us to this final result and to the end of the first demo. So let's jump back to the presentation. So you also once again see here the process flow of the demand of the predictive MRP. And the second demo I would quickly like to touch upon is then the collaborative MRP changes. And here I also mentioned it, the idea is really to streamline the process of checking if a change to MRP is valid with the supplier, with the procurement department. From a process point of view, we start here in the situation that we have run our MRP on a high level, on the finished goods level, everything is fine, but we now check how the situation looks for our components and therefore go into the so-called monitor material coverage application. And there we see for our components, there's even one that is even worse, but we now look at the CM30 where we see, okay, if we don't act, we would have a problem latest after the next weekend. And that's of course not what we want to have. And this is why we look more detailed into the coverage for those components. We go here in the Manage Materials view and basically already see, okay, if we don't act, we will have a problem of or a missing or a loss of 100 pieces in one day. And that's of course something we want to prevent. We also see that simulated here in those embedded graphics again. And what we can now do is really dive into the details of those missing 100 pieces and see how we can mitigate it with the help of the system. So we already see that here, and we can even simulate that. And this is exactly this MRP cockpit view I was also mentioning. It now tells us here exactly, okay, if you don't act, here's a purchase order, but up to the point this purchase order is received, you will have some component bottlenecks here. And system, and that's the really smart thing and innovative thing about it, is the system already proposes us some ways to resolve this issue here. One would be to add a new purchase requisition that is probably a little bit earlier. Let's try to simulate that one. We see that's not possible that much earlier, so it's probably not the best resolution option. And the other option would be to take the existing purchase order and shift it 2 days earlier. We simulate that as well and see that would lead to the fact that we don't have any reds here anymore. And yeah, I mean, that would resolve our problem and also nicely shows how you can, in a visual way, in a really embedded analytics way, show how the optimized situation would look like. As we agree that this would be a good way to do it, we say, okay, let's apply this. But there it of course doesn't end, because you as a material planner saying, okay, I want to shift this purchase order, that is not aligned with the supplier date. So what you do, and this also shows once again the integration, you now trigger here request to the purchasing department to align with the supplier on the feasibility of this purchase order shift. We do that, and the system also tells us there's at least one open change request, so it doesn't change it yet. We now switch back to the purchasing department and already see, and those are those new apps which really manage this life cycle of the request. We already see that we have a new request here indicated by the 1. We go into that and see that's exactly the shifted purchase order that needs to be shifted from the 30th to the 28th. We go into that in more detail, see here also why this is necessary to do that. And we can now, as a purchaser, if we say that that makes sense, we can set that to requested. Let's do that. We see it switches here from new to requested, and it is automatically sent out to the Ariba network. So if we go here in the details, we also see it now has the status pending. And if we now switch to the supplier side in the Ariba network, the supplier, of course, here gets every interaction with its customers here on one dashboard. And one aspect he can look into is order change requests. And this is where hopefully our request is reflected. And if we filter down here, we also see that our request is now here at the supplier side. And the supplier can now select it and decide what he would recommend. So in our case, we make it pretty simple, accept, but it would also be the option to reject or propose an alternative. In our case, we accept here. We add a nice comment here saying, okay, we can confirm that, rescheduling, and submit that back to our customer. Back at the customer, this means the request is now in the answered section. Can open that. We see here it is accepted. If we go into the details, we even can see the note the supplier has sent it to us. And then go back and say, okay, if the supplier confirms that, we can of course apply those changes. Say okay, and we get a confirmation that the delivery date has been changed. And if we now go back into the in the material planners view, we should have reflected the same. And by the way, you also now see here everything is set to 0, so we have no new requests anymore. We then once again go back here in our monitor material coverage app. And now we see for our CM30 material, we are all green. And if we go into the detailed view and simulate again, we also see that exactly the changes we had initially simulated have also been applied and have been aligned with the supplier. With that, I think the second one was a little bit in a rush, but we also have the demo flow here documented in the handout. So feel free to have a more detailed look on that again. With that, I think I've shown two easy to follow examples of how the materials management and the material planning in S/4HANA can be different based on the factors I was mentioning. And yeah, I hope that gave you some insights. And with that, I would already open it up for the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Jakob, for demoing, and also for Stefan for presenting and giving the overview. I guess you can unshare the screen, Jakob, so
yeah, I'm about
everyone can see all of us again. All right, 8 minutes left. That means for you all to be now able to address your questions. We don't yet have any questions in the chat. I know that there's a few community members tuning in from India. So good evening to you guys. Maybe to get the Q&A started, what I always like to do is asking the speakers to summarize the call and share the 5 key takeaways. Maybe Stefan, you want to start, and then Jakob, share your 5 key takeaways for the community members. What is really what they should remember from our 60-minute session? Oh, and you're on mute, Stefan.
You are muted, Stefan.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. So for the manufacturing, S/4HANA for manufacturing, what are the main things? I would say the good things are still there. So that means we have the master data still in sync. We have the transaction data in sync. We have also now some of the goodies from S/4HANA, like that's the second point, leveraging the HANA database, which then allows for our MRP run, MRP Live, to have it run throughout the day and not only, let's say, overnight. Second one is the UI. You saw that UI from Jakob, how it looks not like, let's say, the planner's workbench looks much better than the in the 04 or stock requirements list in the old ECC days. Also, what's good is all this intelligent technologies that we now leverage for manufacturing processes. You saw that part about the lead time calculation, or also for the situation handling for MRP messages. I think this is also a big topic. And the fourth time, it's still that we have all the data in one system and don't need to replicate data from other systems. So that means we have it in sync and no redundancy in the data. These were my 5 points.
That means it's even harder for me to come up with 5 points.
That's why I started.
I don't know if I can make 5, but what I would definitely say is, as you also mentioned, I mean, there's always the scare that something has been lost. That is definitely not the case. We have definitely rather built upon what was already there and have optimized what was already there based on the new technological capabilities and the new paradigms we just have. And we also see from the market perspective that the two streams that are flowing into that. I think a second point that is quite specific is that those 2 apps that from which I also showed one in the demo, they are now available as part of the core. I think that's a good key takeaway. So that that you don't have to pay extra for those anymore. I think the whole topic around artificial intelligence and where we have embedded this in the processes, that is something you should also further monitor closely, because that is really something where we in some areas are just starting, I would say. And also if you look into other areas of S4, you can also see that this leads to a lot of improvements. And what else do we have? I think it is also nice to have seen how it actually looks live. I think that is also something where I recommend you also to look at the videos we have shared, because what we also often hear is, it's nice to tell all the fancy stories around it, but how does it look like in the end, and how does it perform, and how does it work? And especially the first demo that was really just shown live in the system. And I think that is also quite impressive. And yeah, that was 4. What else have we seen? Yeah, I think I leave it with 4 for the moment.
4 is totally fine. Perfect. Thank you. I agree that demoing is always very helpful. And just as an information again to everyone who's listening in, so the recording of this call will be available directly under the link that you are currently streaming. So you can rewatch the content, and as Stefan mentioned, the slide deck will be added to the YouTube description. So everyone can also download the PowerPoint that got shared during the call. I shared a lot of links in the chat. For instance, if there is questions coming up later on, I also shared Stefan's and Jakob's SAP community profile, so you can reach out directly, follow them, and you can directly message them in the SAP community, but also post your questions in the SAP community if you have questions following up on the call that we had today. With that being said, closing words from your side, I would then close the call for today.
Thanks very much for your participation and your interest in the topic, and looking forward to work with you on manufacturing topics.
Exactly. Yeah. Also, thank you for listening, and hopefully it was something you could also get some takeaways from this call now. And of course, yeah, we are looking forward to hear back from you going forward when you hopefully looking even more into S/4HANA topics in the future.
So please, everyone, check out our event listing and groups for upcoming SAP community calls, and take care, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.